The search team halted at the rusted rail bed as the early winter wind cut across the exposed gravel, and the flashlight beam caught a small metallic glint near the frost-hardened soil. A watch lying impossibly alone, its face cracked yet still ticking in the silent dawn that morning there. If you like stories like this, make sure to subscribe and like the video. In Columbus, Ohio, the winter of 1973 settled over the city with a stillness that seemed to mute every sound except the slow rumble of freight trains crossing the rail grid just east of downtown. The watch found near the tracks did not immediately belong to any current missing person entry, but its presence, positioned deliberately rather than dropped, became the pivotal hinge that would separate a routine lost property report from the early formation of a cold case. It was a slender gold-plated women's piece, manufactured mid-decade, with a clasp worn thin from habitual use. Within days, a match surfaced when a family several miles north in Clintonville reported that their daughter, 22-year-old Ohio State University student Margaret Elaine Rowan, had failed to return from her evening library shift. The watch was identified through a gift inscription her father had commissioned, initials etched faintly on the underside, confirming the item belonged to Margaret. What had been a vague unease became a focused search, with the rail perimeter combed by officers and volunteers, the air heavy with diesel odor and winter grit. Margaret's disappearance was initially interpreted as a young adult stepping away from academic stress, but in the police records of the time, the tone shifted quickly once her personal effects began surfacing in disconnected points across the rail yards. A single glove was discovered in a gravel runoff near a service road, and her notebook was later found 3 blocks west, pages soaked from a freezing rain event. The fragmentation of her belongings did not suggest random loss, but rather movement under duress or removal by an unknown party who believed dispersal would obscure the route. Columbus media began coverage in mid-January, images of Margaret printed beside grainy rail corridor photographs. Her academic file revealed no conflicts, financial strain, or social entanglement, leading investigators to consider transit-related encounters. The area near the tracks served as an informal pedestrian shortcut between campus housing and downtown employment sites. In the archive logs, whether notes documented recurring fog conditions during her last known route, a visibility drop that may have enabled an unseen approach. State Bureau of Criminal Identification agents joined local detectives, employing footprint casting along embankment mud, chemical soil analysis, and pattern comparison with rail worker boot prints. No match surfaced. Without a body, the case drifted into procedural limbo by late spring. The watch, sealed in a climate-controlled evidence drawer, became the only physical anchor preventing the file from closure. Over months, the Rowan family maintained newspaper notices, porch lights left on, and weekly inquiries to the precinct, small gestures attempting to keep Margaret present in institutional memory. By the time the file moved to cold case status, Columbus had expanded its transit grid, and the original rail yards underwent partial redevelopment. In 1991, nearly 2 decades later, a construction dig converting an obsolete switching platform uncovered human remains sealed beneath industrial fill. Dental comparison confirmed Margaret Rowan. The soil composition contained metal shards consistent with 1970s rail maintenance debris, narrowing the burial interval to her disappearance window. The watch's cracked crystal now aligned with estimated time of concealed interment, likely damaged during the forced descent into the subgrade layer. Forensic anthropology indicated no prolonged outdoor exposure, supporting rapid concealment following death. Toxicology, though limited by decomposition, detected residual barbiturates, legally prescribed at the time but atypical for Margaret's medical history. Autopsy notes, revised in 1991, pointed to asphyxiation indicators without traumatic skeletal evidence, suggesting controlled compression rather than blunt force. Investigators mapped work rosters from 1973 rail employees, isolating personnel with access to decommissioned platforms and late-shift corridors, narrowing suspect profiles based on presence, opportunity, and transport capability for rapid burial. Among archived employment logs, one name persisted: Raymond Holt, a night maintenance foreman who had resigned abruptly in early 1974. Holt's file noted minor disciplinary actions, including unauthorized equipment use near sealed access pits. By 1991, Holt resided in rural Knox County. Detectives conducted comparative soil retrieval from his former work area, matching mineral ratios and iron oxide concentrations with traces recovered from beneath Margaret's remains. Although circumstantial, it provided directional traction toward a suspect with both proximity and operational knowledge of the rail topography. Digital enhancement of the 1973 witness canvas, transferred from microfilm, revealed a report by a signalman who recalled seeing a woman matching Margaret's appearance escorted by a rail employee toward a service stairwell after midnight. While the signalman's statement lacked identification certainty, the stairwell location matched the sealed pit where the remains were later found. The convergence of spatial coordinates and personnel access solidified the investigative direction. Holt, interviewed in late 1991, denied recollection of Margaret. His responses, though measured, contradicted shift logs placing him in the exact sector the night of her disappearance. Forensic accountants traced Holt's sudden departure to a workplace injury claim filed weeks after Margaret went missing, potentially concealing psychological strain rather than physical harm. Detectives revisited stored evidence, focusing anew on the watch. Minute fiber residues embedded in the band were re-examined using updated microscopy, revealing textile matches to Holt's uniform jacket issued only to supervisory staff. The fiber linkage, paired with soil concordance and access opportunity, enabled prosecutors to convene a grand jury in early 1993. Holt was indicted on charges of homicide and unlawful concealment of remains. In court records, the watch served not as dramatic centerpiece, but as resilient connective artifact bridging decades of investigative dormancy. Testimony from rail engineering experts established that only a foreman with clearance could have activated the platform lift required to deposit a body beneath the industrial fill before sealing the site. Holt entered a plea of guilty to second-degree murder to avoid a full trial, acknowledging in allocution statements that Margaret had been subdued after a confrontation in the rail corridor. Court summaries indicated no prior relationship between them, underscoring the opportunistic nature of the crime. Margaret's family, present for sentencing, requested no media commentary, and local papers respected the restraint, noting only the conclusion of a 20-year investigation and the closure afforded by evidence persistence through a single object. Holt received a 25-year sentence with parole eligibility contingent upon psychiatric evaluation and demonstrable remorse. Court psychologists cited dissociative tendencies and occupational isolation factors prevalent in 1970s industrial shift work. The legal resolution, though measured, reasserted Margaret's presence in municipal memory, ensuring her case would not dissolve into the vast ledger of unresolved disappearances, characteristic of the era's transient corridors and limited surveillance systems. In the aftermath, the rail yard underwent complete redevelopment, with commemorative signage installed along the pedestrian route that once traced Margaret's final path. The watch, now decommissioned from evidence, was returned to the Rowan family, its cracked face preserved exactly as recovered near the tracks. For archivists and investigators, the case illustrated the endurance of physical artifacts across time, the slow accumulation of forensic capability, and the quiet insistence of unresolved facts awaiting eventual convergence. Local memory softened over the years, yet the order of events remained intact in municipal files. Watch, disappearance, rail corridor, sealed platform, exhumation, identification, fiber renewal, prosecution, conviction. In winter, when fog settles across the redeveloped transit line, residents still note the eerie quiet that once obscured a critical moment and a young woman's final passage, now restored to history with precision rather than panic. The file closure entered the city archive with minimal ceremony, marked by a single notation affirming resolution. Nothing in the record elevated the case to sensational narrative. Instead, it remained an instructive template for cold case methodology in a city evolving faster than its infrastructure could register. Margaret's name, once reduced to a flyer and nightly worry, regained permanence through lawful procedure and the subtle persistence of a fractured watch beside winter tracks. As redevelopment continued into the 21st century, transit maps no longer referenced the disused corridors where Margaret vanished. Yet, every winter, when the ground hardens along the reclaimed footpaths, the memory of that solitary watch resurfaces. Investigators who once handled the evidence recall the weight of delayed resolution, the patience required of forensic timelines, and the understated dignity of a case solved not through dramatic confession, but through incremental study of minerals, fibers, and stamped metal. Margaret's legacy rests not in headlines but in procedural clarity, reminding future detectives that even in expansive rail networks and shifting urban landscapes, a single misplaced object can carry an entire truth forward. In the quiet of Columbus winters, the tracks remain, their steel softened by snowfall, holding in their silent geometry the faint memory of a student's route, and the watch that refused to be forgotten by history now finally. The decades that followed Holt's conviction placed the Rowan case into a distinct category in the Columbus archives, one reserved for resolved disappearances, whose answers emerged not from confession or witness revelation, but from the endurance of physical remnants. The watch, catalogued for years in storage, evolved from a simple timekeeping accessory into the hinge, connecting a lost student's route, a concealed burial site, and a rail worker whose routine familiarity with steel, ballast, and maintenance gaps enabled one of the city's quietest crimes. As the city expanded, investigators and archivists traced how urban construction patterns, shifting transit corridors, and industrial repurposing often hid evidence that later resurfaced in unexpected phases of development. Margaret's recovery served as a template in lectures given to state forensic units emphasizing infrastructural awareness when missing persons vanish near transport corridors. Within the Ohio Bureau case review sessions, Margaret's file became exemplar material in cross-department education, not because her narrative was marked by dramatic elements, but because the investigation illustrated persistence against deteriorating traces. Names of rail supervisors, shift records, and maintenance logs, documents often disregarded in typical homicide proceedings, featured prominently in this reconstruction. The Cold Case Division emphasized that work rosters, transit blueprints, and engineering clearance lists remain as vital as DNA swabs and autopsy photographs. Margaret's final hours were never fully reconstructed in granular detail, Yet investigators established enough directional truth to align recorded presence, physical access, and possession of operational keys needed to seal the site. As forensic science advanced, analysts returned to evidence not to overturn the verdict but to refine accuracy. Hair fragments retrieved near the watch, stored carefully in acid-free packaging, were subjected to mitochondrial sequencing unavailable in the early 1990s. The profiles, though degraded, lacked active matches in federal databases, but cemented the exclusionary framework against unknown assailants. The surrounding soil core samples, once evaluated primarily for mineral content, underwent spectrum-based analysis assessing industrial particulates. These particulates aligned with machinery lubricant used exclusively at the rail yard the year Holt supervised night shifts. The evidence did not expand the list of suspects. Instead, it narrowed historical possibility, removing any residual ambiguity that might have circulated in legal appeals. Holt's parole hearings, commencing after mandatory sentence intervals, were noted in public record but drew little community attention. He remained largely silent during proceedings, answering procedural questions with brevity. Psychological evaluations described him as cooperative but emotionally detached, exhibiting no active aggression or opposition but minimal introspective engagement with the offense. The Rowan family, when present, declined to read statements, choosing private observance over direct confrontation. Their reserve, consistent across the decades, shaped how local journalists documented the case, avoiding dramatic prose and restricting coverage to official hearing outcomes. Columbus, by the early 2000s, had transformed its industrial core. The rail yards that once defined the city's freight identity had ceded ground to mixed-use developments, pedestrian lanes, and commercial spaces. Yet city planners quietly preserved the section of walkway nearest to the former switching platform, embedding a modest plaque, not decorative or sentimental but informational, acknowledging the location's relevance to a solved missing person file. It was not a memorial in the interpretive sense, simply a geographic marker ensuring historical accuracy. The Rowan family agreed to the placement only after assurances that the plaque would reflect procedural truth rather than emotional tribute. University archives also maintained Margaret's academic standing, noting her coursework, expected graduation trajectory, and research interests in early American literature. Faculty members who once supervised her studies provided retrospective statements stored in the institutional file, but not released broadly. The campus community eventually integrated her narrative into annual safety briefings for students navigating city-adjacent transit paths. In these briefings, her case served not as deterrent fear, but as demonstration of investigative longevity in circumstances where immediate clarity is absent. In 2012, a statewide symposium on cold case methodologies included Margaret's case as part of a chronological review detailing the transition from analog documentation to digitized forensic indexing. Speakers emphasized the value of unembellished record-keeping and careful evidence retention. The watch, still in family possession, was referenced not as symbolic artifact, but as demonstration of how personal items, when cataloged correctly, preserve trace fibers and adhesives that withstand decades of oxidation. Students attending the symposium recorded the presentation without emotional inflection, noting timestamps, chain of custody principles, and storage temperature protocols. Later that year, a quiet initiative emerged within the Columbus Police Department to re-examine all transit-adjacent disappearances predating 1980. No significant parallels materialized with Margaret's details. The controlled access, concealment method, and specific platform usage in her case remained anomaly rather than pattern, reinforcing why Holt's conviction held legal and historical solidity. Analysts reviewed labor union files, cross-checked shift abandonment reports, and compared rail yard incident logs to identify any unreported injuries or missing persons connected to Holt's tenure. The absence of any additional link underscored the singularity of Margaret's case in his occupational span. Holt's final parole hearing, recorded in a simple transcript, resulted in denial. He never contested the decision nor filed appeals. In the years leading to his passing, medical summaries described age-related decline rather than psychiatric instability. His death generated no commentary beyond a small county notice. With his passing, legal custodians marked the Rowan matter as fully concluded, investigation resolved, perpetrator deceased, evidence unchallenged. Margaret's file transitioned to historical classification, stored in temperature-controlled archive stacks, alongside resolved cases whose answers had arrived long after their openings. Columbus, now several development cycles removed from the rail era that shaped Margaret's timeline, refrained from narrative reinvention. No dramatized retellings surfaced in anniversary articles, and the Rowan family avoided interviews, maintaining the quiet dignity that characterized their presence from initial disappearance through legal resolution. The municipal archives, however, preserved the procedural depth of her file for criminological study. Her name appeared periodically in academic texts discussing cold case evolution, not highlighted for emotional resonance but for procedural discipline. In winter months, when the city's skyline reflects pale sunlight against frozen sidewalks, the pedestrian path along the former rail line remains in operation. Commuters traverse it without awareness of its investigative legacy. Only at close inspection does the embedded plaque reveal factual summary: a missing student, a discovered watch, a concealed burial beneath industrial ballast, and eventual resolution through forensic persistence. Passers-by seldom pause to read it, yet its presence ensures historical coordinates remain intact, unobscured by redevelopment. For cold case analysts reviewing historical precedents, Margaret's file endures as exemplar not in drama but in restraint. It illustrates that solved cases do not always culminate in narrative clarity, emotional catharsis, or elaborate confession. Instead, they often conclude through quiet, evidence-led convergence, steady review of archival fragments, and processing of materials stored for decades awaiting advances in science and administrative will. Her timeline reinforces that time does not erase truth when preservation is methodical, chain of custody unbroken, and investigative focus steady. As city soundscapes shift from freight horns to commuter rhythms, the memory of the watch near the tracks no longer carries terror or rumor. It is simply part of municipal record, a key in the chronology of forensic development. The platform that once concealed her remains is now inaccessible, buried below modern foundations, yet its coordinates persist in surveyor maps, linked directly to an inscription on a recovered timepiece, and a precise point in winter dawn where investigators once knelt to examine metal glinting against frost. For archivists who rotate case files every quarter, the Rowan documents receive standard handling, gloves, humidity protection, digital duplication, and no embellishment. The fact pattern stands alone: disappearance in 1973, discovery in 1991, conviction in 1993, final closure in subsequent decades. In a city that has learned to balance memory against forward momentum, Margaret's presence remains not in public ceremony, but in accurate ledgers and procedural truth. That ultimately is her legacy, neither forgotten nor dramatized, but preserved exactly as the record demands, secured against distortion by the very quietness that defined her case. The watch that once lay beside Winter tracks now exists only in stillness, returned to a family that asked for no spectacle, no extended coverage, and no retellings beyond the steady, factual account that the investigation produced over decades of unbroken scrutiny. In the final accounting of the Rowan investigation, what remained most striking to those who studied it was not the eventual conviction, nor the technical pathway by which an artifact and soil trace forced a forgotten night foreman into judicial exposure, but the sustained clarity with which every piece of preserved material resisted disappearance. Cold cases often erode not through investigative failure, but through time's quiet abrasion of relevance. Yet in this record, the watch, soil, fiber, and location held their alignment across decades. Students of forensic methodology who encountered the file in training viewed it as an austere demonstration of evidentiary endurance. There were no narrative ascents, no digressive suspect webs, no late confessions or coded letters. Instead, the case progressed from absence to presence through rigor and delay. Within professional circles, the Rowan file came to represent the category known internally as dormancy without disintegration. It is a classification rarely invoked because evidence in most long-term cases tends to disperse, degrade, or lose chain-of-custody precision. Margaret's belongings, however, were secured meticulously from the earliest days of her disappearance. As developments advanced in laboratory technology, her materials accommodated each update, providing new readings without introducing contradiction. In forensic culture, where many archives sit unresolved or unidentifiable, this coherence carried weight beyond its immediate resolution. The Columbus legal community referenced the case when considering reform measures that would later shape state retention standards. In 2017, a policy revision recommended extended preservation windows for items recovered in transit-adjacent disappearance investigations. While Margaret's name was not explicitly attached to the amendment, the case file informed the rationale in committee notes. The justification cited the potential for infrastructural redevelopment to reveal long-concealed remains or objects previously inaccessible during initial sweeps. The city's evolving geometry, documented in construction permits and planning schematics, underscored how the physical landscape could hold answers that digital archives alone could not. Similarly, the Ohio State University campus police incorporated the Rowan timeline into internal briefings on unresolved student disappearances predating widespread surveillance. It was not presented as cautionary warning, but as procedural case study demonstrating how geographic familiarity, routine pathing, and predictable schedule patterns create investigative maps. Margaret's consistent walking route, though ordinary in her daily life, became essential to understanding how access and opportunity intersected for the perpetrator. This was central not as moral instruction, but as historical framework illustrating vulnerability within industrial corridors before campus transit redesigns and improved lighting grid overlays. Media, which often seeks narrative curvature or sensational contrast, largely refrained from revisiting the Rowan story after the early 1990s. What coverage existed remained confined to municipal release summaries or academic reference. There were no anniversary specials, dramatized reenactments, or retrospective editorials. The restraint stemmed from both family preference and the nature of the resolution, a case solved through gradual, unembellished forensic consolidation rather than emotional revelation. In a media landscape inclined toward escalation, the Rowan investigation held its shape as a counterexample: truth without theatrics, closure without catharsis. Margaret's personal documents, returned privately to the family following adjudication, did not reappear in research or publication. University archivists honored the decision to withhold portions of her academic writing, correspondence, and library logs. The internal record, while complete, remained partitioned from public access. Respect for that boundary became part of the archival culture surrounding the case. Students studying the file encountered only what was necessary for procedural comprehension: disappearance date, recovery site, identification confirmation, access records, platform sealing, conviction, sentencing, and subsequent appeals. No supplemental narrative frames were permitted to shape emotional overlay. In quiet neighborhoods north of downtown, older residents occasionally referenced the disappearance when discussing shifts in rail traffic patterns over the decades. These mentions carried a factual tone rather than nostalgia or unease. The city's relationship to the rail grid had transformed sufficiently that few residents maintained direct memory of the corridors as they existed during the early 1970s. The shift from freight priority to streamlined commuter design removed the environmental context that had allowed the original crime to occur without witness continuity. Contemporary travelers passing through the redeveloped zone encountered only surface-level infrastructure, unaware of what the subgrade layers once concealed. The plaque marking the route persisted, modest in dimension and without ornamentation. Its wording remained unchanged: a notation of disappearance, a date range covering recovery and resolution, an acknowledgement of investigative procedure. Those who paused long enough to read it encountered a distillation of decades, unadorned by conjecture or narrative tone. The plaque did not attempt to interpret Margaret's presence or the nature of what occurred. It stood simply as confirmation that the route carried historical weight. In urban design, where commemorative markers often lean toward memorial, this one remained strictly informational. Rail authorities who succeeded Holt in supervisory roles maintained no institutional memory of him beyond what his personnel file documented. His tenure was treated administratively rather than psychologically. There were no internal reclassifications, no posthumous assessments. His name appeared only in case citations when cold case investigators presented procedural review. In this way, the perpetrator's presence in the record diminished proportionally as the clarity of Margaret's identification and recovery solidified. The focus shifted, not through editorial preference, but through forensic gravity. The victim's preserved timeline outweighed the offender's transient occupational footprint. By 2020, digital consolidation of historical case files placed Margaret's record into a secure state database. Access remained limited to certified investigators, licensed researchers, and training officials. No public portal linked to the case. For students analyzing the cold case record, the Rowan file exemplified restraint. It demonstrated that not every solved disappearance transitions into cultural memory. Some remain embedded in institutional history, their details reserved for professional examination rather than narrative circulation. In criminological study, her case offered grounding, a reminder that investigative success does not necessitate public echo. In exploring why the Rowan file retained clarity where others dissipated, scholars noted the congruence between object, environment, and documentation. The watch, though small, provided tactile continuity. The buried platform, though sealed, provided spatial certainty. The personnel logs, though routine, provided direct access mapping. Each element carried definitive context rather than interpretive nuance. This quality aligned with forensic preferences for certainty over inference, chain of custody over recollection, and geographical precision over narrative speculation. For the Rowan family, closure did not manifest through commemoration but through accurate record. The return of the watch concluded their involvement with institutional processes. No additional legal actions, civil filings, or memorial developments followed. They withdrew from public record, allowing the case's procedural design to stand on its own. In their absence from commentary, the case settled into quiet permanence rather than cultural reinforcement. Their choice shaped its legacy. Today, the former rail zone functions as pedestrian infrastructure, intersecting commercial developments and residential buildings without overt sign of its historical role. Beneath paved surfaces and foundational concrete lie the sealed strata once excavated to recover remains. The geography shifted, but the coordinates did not. Survey maps maintain permanent trace of the original platform, now irrelevant to transit scheduling but essential to investigative history. Trains no longer run through that corridor, yet in archived blueprints and marked diagrams, its presence is immovable. In closing, the Columbus 1973 investigation stands as a rare resolution where evidence bore the narrative burden without embellishment, without myth, without public retelling. A watch found near tracks in winter, a sealed platform unearthed nearly 20 years later, a solitary suspect bound by access rather than confession. These elements formed a linear, unadorned path to truth. Margaret's disappearance, once absorbed into the hushed anxiety of a city's industrial dusk, now resides in precise documentation. The case's integrity rests not in emotional resonance, but in procedural completion, the quiet finality of a solved file that requires nothing further from history.